Hey everyone, welcome to another episode. And today we're going to be talking about expectations. Yes, this is still another episode in the series Worship Leaders Must, but we're going to talk about expectations and what worship leaders must or must not do with said expectations. So stick with me, it should be a good one. Welcome to Anything Goes, a journey home, a place to find hope, encouragement, inspiration, and motivation to do the same on your journey wherever life may take you. I'm your host, Andrew Geist, and today we are in another episode of Worship Leaders Must. For those of you who don't know, if you're new to the channel, yes, I have done a whole host of different topics and a whole host of different conversational pieces, as well as shared the mic with several wonderful people over my tenure as a podcaster. But for those of you who don't know, I am a worship pastor full-time. I work at a church in Katy, Texas with some wonderful people, and I have been working in church as a full-time career for the last 15 years of my life. I've been doing worship leading primarily for those 15 years and much more, but specifically worship ministry, and I've done it at small church level of about 100 people in California, in Southern California, and then about a 600 to 1,000 person church in Central California in Fresno, and then now here of about 1,000 plus people on a Sunday between two services in Katy, Texas. So I know what I'm talking about, and I hope that you'll stick around as I talk about expectations and what worship leaders must do. So the first thing I want to talk about is worship leaders must adjust their expectations. Over my career, serving at 3 different churches now in my life, as well as serving as a volunteer at other churches throughout my youth, I've seen a lot of worship leaders come and go. And the ones that have stuck around and the ones that have stayed are the ones who've understood the assignment. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that they understood that the reality of their situation was that they might have been stepping in to a church in which they are picking up where someone left off. For example, the church I'm working at now. I stepped into this position in service to somebody else, and then subsequently over time took over. And the worship culture was already in existence. So my expectations could not have been one in which I turned the whole worship ministry upside down and on its head. That would have been a terrible idea. But I also need to adjust my expectations because the church that I came at from before worshipped in a very different context. And my expectations there were different from the church that I served at before that. So whether you're stepping into a scenario or even if you're stepping into a situation where you're building from the ground up and you are the one who is setting up expectations, perhaps, you might find over time that those expectations have to be adjusted. Why? Because you're dealing with people. People are very complex, complicated creatures, and frankly, at the same time, fairly predictable. We all struggle with change. We're also very terrible at adapting to new situations. And for the most part, once we find something we like, we kind of ride it until it's dead. So the reality is, as we go through this experience, we have to learn to adjust our expectations to the people, the church, the culture, and the congregation that we're serving. What might work for you in one church as an expectation may not work for you in another church in a different context. For example, if you were working in a Baptist church and you moved to a Catholic church, I'd imagine the expectations of you would be starkly contrasted from the expectations of a Catholic church versus a Baptist church. Terrible example, but you get my point. Now, the second thing that worship leaders must do is they actually need to give up their expectations more than keep them. What do I mean by that? Worship leaders oftentimes will find themselves in this trap and this pattern of having an expectation when they step into worship that if the worship team doesn't do fill in the blank, then worship was not successful. If the congregation doesn't participate at this specific level, worship wasn't successful. if we don't have X amount of people in each service, then worship wasn't successful. These expectations, whether they are stated, felt, or internalized, are all expectations that, frankly, may not always be realistic, and for that matter, probably should be given up. Now, there are also scenarios in which you have an expectation of, I expect everybody to show up on time, and I expect everybody to show up prepared. Now, if you're in a context like me, where we don't have a midweek rehearsal because all of my musicians are incredibly talented and they've proven themselves trustworthy to show up on Sunday and go for an hour, maybe 45 minutes in rehearsal to prepare for Sunday. That's how incredible they are. And they're all volunteers. Trust me, I know all of you out there who are worship leaders who are fighting tooth and nail to find volunteers who are that gifted and that talented. I understand how blessed I am. Believe me. But let me throw out a hypothetical situation to you. Let's say that people started to not meet that expectation. One of the reasons why you might have to give up that expectation is because you might have to create a new expectation. So if your culture is starting to feel a decline in your worship, both in excellence and preparedness and professionalism, then what you might have to do is you might have to adjust or give up your expectation of come prepared, but instead set the expectation of no, we're going to rehearse midweek. And the expectation is that you show up on time, you show up prepared, and we'll rehearse for an hour, and that will prepare us for Sunday morning. At the same time, I've also been a part of churches where we would do a midweek rehearsal, we'd show up Sunday, and we still were not anywhere near a level of excellence or professionalism that we kind of come to know in today's world. What do I mean by that? The unfortunate reality is for worship leaders, week in and week out, an expectation is actually kind of set on us every single week by the standard of the industry, which is the concert venue. What do I mean by that? A lot of people go to concerts to be entertained, to disconnect, and also enjoy music that they really, really love. This can range from secular music to Christian music to country music to rap, you name it. But the standard there is really high. And all of the musicians, for those of you who aren't aware, are all paid. All of the musicians that are performing in that space are paid. All of the people that are in support of that artist or that musician that's on stage are paid, from the production all the way through the lights, the video, you name it. Everyone is paid in that situation. Churches don't always have that luxury. And the expectation for most people when they come to church on Sunday, whether spoken or unspoken, is resting on the shoulder of most worship pastors to meet that standard by the experience they have on Sunday morning. Now, I could get into a hotly contested debate with most everybody on the online platform about the biblical standard versus the concert standard. I'm not going to do that in this episode. But my point is, that might be, as a worship pastor, an expectation that you have to give up, and you might have to surrender to God and trust that if you put in the work and you put in the effort and you show value to your volunteers, as well as encouraging and building them up in profound ways, both equipping them in their technical skills as a musician, but also in their spiritual skills as a musician, you might find that over time, and that's the real key factor there as far as expectations are concerned, which is you might need to give up the expectation that you're going to turn it over in a short amount of time. So if you're taking an average band to a great band, you have to accept the reality that maybe the expectation has to be given up, that it's going to turn over in 6 months. Maybe it has to be more like a year. Maybe it has to be a year and a half. And depending on the band and how big your volunteer team is, if you have a rotation of people, we're talking about something that now the expectations are even more complex, because every rotation of people is one less opportunity for that band member to play with another band member. You can see where this kind of starts to fall apart. So, worship leaders need to give up their expectations sometimes. Not all times, but sometimes. Lastly, and this is the most important one, worship leaders must communicate their expectations. Just like I said, if you're the kind of culture that has a midweek rehearsal and a rehearsal on Sunday, communicate that expectation. If you have an expectation that people show up on time, that they know their music, maybe even memorize their music, then communicate that expectation. If you walk through your ministry and just kind of expect people to do this thing for you, not realizing that you might be the only person in the scenario where you are getting paid to do this thing and everybody else is doing it voluntarily, i.e., it is not their job, so they don't actually treat it with the same level of professionalism as they do with their actual job, then yeah, you need to communicate your expectations. Because if your expectation is that they have a professionalism with that volunteer position and an expectation and that professionalism is at a high standard, i.e., like I said, the concert standard, then you need to communicate that, because guess what? If you don't and you just let it go by, and over time things decline, and then there's an expectation of you of things not improving, now all of a sudden your volunteers might be dropping like flies, because for them it was always just something that they could do for fun, that they enjoyed, and they honestly came because they wanted to worship God with their gifts. And that's ultimately where it comes back to, and why communicating your expectations is so important. The reality is you can't set expectations for your team if you don't actually have those expectations of yourself. And this includes being prepared, rehearsing, memorizing your music, being spiritually grounded in your Bible, and praying and attending church and attending life groups or attending whatever it is your small group situation might be. If you don't have that expectation of yourself, how can you possibly expect other people on your team to do that as well? So let's go over it again. Worship leaders need to adjust their expectations. Every situation and scenario you find yourself in is going to require you to adjust your expectations, from your team to your congregation to your worship expectation to your definition of success, to so many others. And then the other thing that a worship leader might do, as you adjust, you might realize you need to give up some expectations, because maybe those expectations are not worth fighting for right now, but might be worth fighting for later. And maybe you need to create new expectations. And then finally, if you're not communicating your expectations, then yes, your worship ministry will suffer. Your worship ministry will even fall apart, and you have the potential, you will run the risk of losing people in the process because you're not communicating your expectations. This can be down to the very finite nature of how you're playing a particular song on any given Sunday, to the point of how a service order will flow, to the point of letting everyone around you know that this is what you expect Sunday to be like. That's the level of communication and the specificity of communicating those expectations that you should have week in, week out, with every person you come in contact with on your team, in your staff, and especially with your pastor. So I want you to do something. The question is, which of these do you need to work on? Are you not particularly good at adjusting your expectations and you need to work on that? Then work on it. If you are not particularly good at giving up your expectations, maybe we need to practice humility and let some of those expectations go. But I also point you back to point one. Maybe you don't have to give them up, but maybe you need to adjust them. And finally, do you need to work on communicating your expectations? Look, communication, I think, in every environment, in every working place, and churches are no exception, communication, bar none, is always something that has to be worked on. It always has to be adjusted. It always needs to be perfected, practiced, and honed in. It's never fully done. It is a process that continually changes and shapes and molds based off of so many factors. And so if you're not in the habit of communicating your expectations, then I would encourage you to really step up and change how you think about that, because it's easy to adjust. And frankly, it's also easy to give up expectations. It is really, really essential to communicate your expectations, because without those, then nobody knows that they're failing. Nobody knows that they're not meeting those expectations, and something has to give. And usually, it's not you, it's usually the people that are volunteering for you that give by leaving. So, communicate, communicate, communicate. Thanks for listening to the podcast today, for liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you're watching on YouTube or listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you can get notified every time I take a journey home. If you would like to support this podcast, there's a link below and in the show notes. You can find all previous seasons and episodes from this season at ajourneyhome.blog, and you can connect with me at aguy'sproduction.com or through the socials below and in the show notes. Now, let's be kind to each other, show faith, love, and hope to those who need it. Have a great week. I'm going home.